Wild West love stories. Tales of passion written on the American frontier.
The wind in the Montana territories has a voice. It speaks of forgotten sorrows and promises broken like bone. Tonight, it screamed through the skeletal pines of the Wolf Jaw Ridge, carrying with it the scent of snow and blood. Inside a dilapidated line shack, lit by a single, sputtering lantern, that scent was overpowering. A man, a prospector by the looks of his torn clothes and calloused hands, was tied to a chair. His face was a mess of purple bruises and fresh cuts. Across from him, leaning against the wall, was a figure carved from malice and memory. His name was Jedediah Kane. He was missing his left arm from the elbow down, the sleeve pinned neatly to his worn leather vest. His remaining hand, scarred and powerful, polished a silver flask. He didn't need to raise his voice. The wind did the shouting for him. "Last time," Jedediah said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The man you guided up here, Blackwood. Where's his claim?" The prospector spat a bloody tooth onto the floorboards. "Go to hell." Jedediah sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. He took a slow sip from his flask, then placed it carefully on the table. He picked up a piece of paper lying next to it, a wanted poster. It showed a woman's face, crudely drawn, with the name Elara Vance printed below. But Jedediah wasn't looking at the face. He was looking at a name scrawled in the margins by one of his informants. "Seen with Silas Blackwood." A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Some folks think I'm hunting this girl for the $50 reward," he mused, tapping the paper. "But you see, the girl is just the bait. It's the man who's with her. He's an old friend. My captain." He leaned in, his eyes like chips of ice. "And I've come to collect a debt he owes me." The prospector's eyes widened in terror, but his scream was swallowed by the wind and the night. A few miles away, in the muddy, desperate streets of the town called Redemption, that same wind tore at the coat of Silas Blackwood. He moved through a filthy alleyway, not with the swagger of a cowboy, but with the grim purpose of a predator. He found her there, cornered by two of Madame Evangeline's hired thugs. It was the girl he'd seen earlier, the one with eyes that held the same haunted emptiness as his own. Elara Vance. Her blouse was torn, a trickle of blood on her lip. Silas didn't draw a gun. He didn't speak. He simply became a shadow in motion. A blur of precise, brutal violence that ended as quickly as it began, leaving two men groaning in the mud. He stood over her, breathing steady, his face an unreadable mask in the darkness. He offered a hand. She flinched, but took it. Her fingers were as cold as a grave. Will this quiet stranger be her salvation, or just a different kind of cage? Stay with us to witness a journey born from desperation and a love forged in the heart of darkness. And if you believe in second chances, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more tales from the Wild West. Part 1. Echoes in a Bitter Wind. The town of Redemption was built on a foundation of lies and whiskey, a muddy purgatory between the unforgiving mountains and the sprawling, empty plains. At its heart, pulsing like a diseased organ, was the gilded cage, Madame Evangeline's saloon and brothel. From the outside, it boasted a fresh coat of paint and glass windows, a veneer of civility in a lawless land. Inside, however, the air was thick with the stench of cheap perfume, stale cigar smoke, and quiet despair. Elara Vance knew this despair intimately. It was the taste in her mouth when she woke, the weight on her shoulders as she scrubbed floors, the chill in her bones that no fire could warm. She was a prisoner, not of iron bars, but of a debt she could never repay, a debt left behind by a dead husband she no longer recognized in her memories. She moved through the morning chores like a ghost, her presence barely registering to the other girls, whose laughter sounded brittle and sharp. Her sickness, a persistent cough that sometimes brought blood, made her useless for the brothel's primary trade, so she was relegated to the endless, back-breaking labor that kept the establishment running. It was during one of these mornings, while emptying a wastebasket in Evangeline's private office, that her life took a turn. The door was ajar, and the voices from within were low and conspiratorial. One was Madame Evangeline, smooth and venomous as a snake. The other belonged to Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from back east, his words clipped and precise. "The survey maps are fakes, of course," Abernathy was saying. "They show the creek running a half-mile south of its actual course. The railroad will pay a fortune for that water access, believing it's part of the parcel you acquired from those dirt-poor ranchers." Evangeline laughed, a sound like ice cracking. They were happy to sell. A few $100s and a promise of a better life elsewhere. They didn't know their land was worthless without the water, and the land with the water was never theirs to begin with. Elara froze, her hand clutching the tin bucket. She understood. Fraud. A massive, cruel deception that would ruin families and make Evangeline, already the town's unofficial queen, powerful beyond measure. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. But her heel caught on a loose floorboard, producing a faint creak. The voices inside stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than their words. Elara fled, her breath catching in her throat, the secret she now carried a burning coal in her gut. Later that day, Silas Blackwood rode into redemption. He did not look like a man seeking pleasure or trouble. He rode a sturdy gray mare, his gear worn but well-maintained, his movements economical and deliberate. He tied his horse outside the general store, his eyes scanning the street, missing nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the world through the sights of a rifle for too long, eyes that catalogued threats and escape routes instinctively. He was here for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, cartridges, a month's worth, so he wouldn't have to endure the town's suffocating presence again for as long as possible. As he stepped out of the store, a commotion from across the street drew his attention. A woman had collapsed while trying to haul a heavy barrel of water up the steps to the gilded cage. It was Elara. Two of Evangeline's men stood over her, not helping, but sneering. "Get up, you useless stray!" one of them barked, kicking the barrel so water sloshed onto her thin dress. "Madam wants the floors cleaned before the evening rush." Elara coughed, a deep, racking sound that shook her entire frame. She pushed herself up, her face pale and streaked with mud. Her eyes, filled with a defiant exhaustion, met Silas's for a fleeting second. In that single glance, he saw it all. The broken spirit, the caged will, the quiet plea for an end that wasn't death, but was something close to it. It was a look he knew well. He had seen it in the faces of dying soldiers, in the eyes of freed slaves, and in the mirror every single morning. He said nothing. He simply adjusted the sack of flour on his shoulder and turned to leave. He was not a hero. He had buried that part of himself long ago in the blood-soaked soil of Georgia. His only concern was survival, and survival meant staying invisible. But as he walked toward his horse, the sound of a sharp slap cracked through the air, followed by a choked cry. Silas stopped. His jaw tightened, the muscles bunching under the weathered skin. He had told himself he was done. Done with fighting, done with killing, done with caring. But the past was a stubborn ghost, and some echoes refused to fade. He slowly turned back, the cold, detached mask on his face beginning to crack, revealing the embers of a man he thought was long dead. When Silas turned, the world seemed to narrow to the space between him and the two thugs tormenting Elara. The clamor of the street, the rumble of a passing wagon, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shrill laughter from the saloon, faded into a dull roar. There was only the girl on the ground, and the casual cruelty of the men standing over her. He walked toward them, his steps unhurried, each one landing with a quiet finality on the muddy earth. He didn't speak, didn't issue a challenge. His presence was challenge enough. The two men, beefy and accustomed to intimidating the weak, turned as his shadow fell over them. "What do you want, stranger?" The first one sneered, puffing out his chest. "This ain't your business." Silas didn't answer him. His gaze was fixed on Elara, who was pushing a stray strand of hair from her face with a trembling hand, leaving a smear of mud on her cheek. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her temple, the split in her lower lip. These were not new injuries. They were layers of a long and brutal history. He finally lifted his eyes to meet the thugs. "Let her be," he said. The words were not a request. They were a statement, flat and cold as a tombstone. The two men exchanged an amused look. "Or what?" The second one chimed in, resting a hand on the butt of his pistol. "You gonna make us?" Silas's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness shifted. It was the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the way his hand, which had been resting on his thigh, now hung loose, inches from his own holstered gun. It was a posture of lethal patience, learned on battlefields where the slightest hesitation meant death. Before either man could react, Madame Evangeline herself appeared at the top of the steps, her silk dress a vibrant slash of purple against the brothel's garish red facade. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Her eyes, hard and calculating, took in the scene at a glance, her men, the defiant stranger, and the problem on the ground. She descended the steps, her gaze landing on Silas. "Whatever this is, I assure you, it is a private matter concerning my employee." Sevens. Silas finally looked at her. "She's sick," he stated. Evangeline's smile was a razor's edge. "She is lazy, a condition that a firm hand can often cure." She gestured to her men. "Bring her inside. And you, sir," she said to Silas, "I suggest you move along before you attract the wrong kind of attention." But Silas didn't move. He held Evangeline's gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She was used to men who were loud, boorish, and easily manipulated by fear or desire. This man was none of those things. He was a void, an unnerving silence. "How much?" Silas asked quietly. Evangeline blinked. "I beg your pardon." "How much?" he repeated, his voice still low, but now carrying a sharp edge. "For her contract? For her debt?" The question hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. The two thugs stared, bewildered. Elara, still on her knees, looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a terrifying, nascent hope. Evangeline was the first to recover, a look of avaricious understanding dawning on her face. She saw not a savior, but a customer with a peculiar taste. "She is a significant investment," Evangeline purred, circling him like a vulture. "Her late husband's debts were substantial, and I have provided her with room and board for nearly a year." Silas reached into his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't count the coins or bills. He simply tossed the entire pouch at her feet. It landed in the mud with a heavy, satisfying thud. "That's everything I have," he said. "Take it or leave it." Evangeline's eyes darted from the pouch to Silas's face, then to Elara, a flicker of fury passing through them. She was losing a pawn, and worse, a witness. But the weight of that pouch was undeniable. Greed won out over caution. "Very well," she said, snatching the pouch from the mud. "She is your problem now. Get her out of my sight." Silas didn't offer a word of thanks. He stepped forward, bent down, and helped Elara to her feet. She was unsteady, her body trembling with shock and weakness. He put a steadying arm around her waist, half carrying her toward his horse. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch the spectacle parted before them, whispering amongst themselves. As Silas lifted Elara onto the saddle and mounted behind her, he glanced back one last time. Madame Evangeline was standing on the steps, her face a mask of cold fury. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, a new war was declared. Silas turned the mare and urged her into a steady trot, leaving the corrupt heart of redemption behind them. They rode out into the vast, open wilderness, a man running from his past and a woman with no future, bound together by a desperate act of defiance. The wind howled around them, as if trying to reclaim them, but for the first time in a long time, for both of them, it sounded less like a threat and more like the beginning of a song. Part 2. The Embers of Kindness. The journey to Silas's cabin was a blur of exhaustion and fear for Elara. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head resting against the solid wall of his back, the rhythmic plodding of the horse a grim lullaby. The world was a collage of towering pines, jagged rock faces, and a sky the color of slate. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through her bruised ribs, but it was a distant pain, muffled by a profound sense of dislocation. She didn't know this man. She didn't know where he was taking her, or why. Every story she'd ever heard about men who bought girls ended in a place darker than the one she'd just left. Yet, the arm that held her steady around the waist was just that, steady. It wasn't cruel or possessive. It was firm, impersonal, a simple anchor in a turbulent sea. She smelled the scent of pine, leather, and the cold mountain air clinging to his coat. It was a clean smell, a world away from the cloying perfume and rot of the gilded cage. They arrived just as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of purple and rose. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, shielded by a dense stand of aspen and fir. It was small and rough-hewn, more a fortress against the wilderness than a home, with smoke curling weakly from its stone chimney. It looked lonely as the man who lived there. Silas dismounted with a quiet grace, then reached up to help her down. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her from the saddle, and for a moment she felt as light as a child. He set her on her feet, but her legs buckled immediately. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. The door creaked open into a single, dimly lit room. It was sparse and utilitarian, but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a cot was pushed against another, and a simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center. Everything had its place. It was the space of a man who lived by a strict, self-imposed discipline. He laid her gently on the cot, which was covered with a thick bear pelt. The sudden softness after days of sleeping on a straw pallet in a cold cellar was a shock. He moved away from her immediately, giving her space, and began to stoke the dying embers in the hearth. He worked with an efficient, practiced rhythm, adding kindling and then larger logs until a hearty fire crackled to life, casting flickering orange shadows across the log walls. The warmth began to seep into Elara's chilled bones, a comfort so foreign it was almost painful. She watched him, wary and silent, as he moved about the cabin. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket by the door and hung it over the fire. He checked the action on a rifle that rested on pegs above the mantelpiece, his movements precise and familiar. He did not speak to her, did not even look at her for more than a brief, assessing glance. It was as if she were a piece of freight he had delivered and was now simply storing. This silence was more unnerving than threats. She was accustomed to noise, to drunken shouts and cruel commands. This quiet was a vacuum, and her fear rushed in to fill it. When the water was hot, Silas poured some into a basin, added a clean rag, and brought it to the cot. He knelt beside her, his face impassive. "Your face," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her since they'd left Redemption. She flinched as he reached for her, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the dried blood from her lip and the mud from her cheek with slow, methodical movements. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his hand was steady. He was all contradictions, a capacity for swift violence wrapped in a shroud of quiet gentleness. He finished, his gaze lingering for a second on the bruise coloring her temple. He saw not the injury, but the ghost of the man who had inflicted it, and a muscle in his jaw twitched. He stood abruptly and walked away, his back to her. "There's stew in the pot," he said, gesturing to the hearth. "Eat. Then rest." He took a blanket from a chest at the foot of his own bed, a simple roll of bedding on the opposite side of the room, and laid it over her. Then he picked up his rifle, slung a coat over his shoulders, and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. Elara was left alone with the crackling fire, the smell of stew, and the profound, terrifying silence of a life she had not chosen but was now forced to live. She didn't know if he would be back. She didn't know what he wanted. She only knew that for the first time in a year, she was warm, and no one was yelling at her to get back to work. She ate the stew, thick with venison and potatoes, and it tasted like a forgotten memory. Then she lay back, pulling the heavy blanket to her chin, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known in an eternity. The first few days in Silas's cabin unfolded in a silent, watchful rhythm. Elara woke each morning to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and a bowl of something warm, oatmeal or leftover stew, left on the small crate beside her cot. Silas would already be gone, out checking his trap lines or chopping wood, the steady, metronomic thud of his axe echoing through the crisp mountain air. He gave her solitude as if it were a precious gift, an antidote to the suffocating proximity of the gilded cage. At first, she did little more than sleep, the deep, healing sleep of an animal gone to ground. Her body, long deprived of rest and proper nourishment, greedily soaked up the peace. Her cough began to subside, the racking spasms replaced by a shallower, less painful tremor. The bruises on her face faded from angry purple to a mottled yellow-green, and the cut on her lip began to knit itself closed. When she felt stronger, she began to move about the cabin. It was a small space, but it was his, and she was careful not to disturb the quiet order of his life. She noted the way he stacked his firewood, the neat row of tins on the shelf, the single, well-worn book on the mantelpiece, a copy of Shakespeare's tragedies. She saw the ghosts he lived with in the way he would sometimes stop and stare at the fire, his eyes distant and clouded with memories he never spoke of. She saw it in the violent thrashing of his sleep, the muffled groans that he thought she couldn't hear from across the room. He was as wounded as she was, his scars simply hidden deeper. Hesitantly, she began to contribute. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She washed the few dishes they used, her hands clumsy at first. One afternoon, while he was out, she found a needle and thread in a small tin box and mended a tear in his coat. It was a small act, almost invisible, but when he returned and put the coat on, he paused, his fingers tracing the neat line of her stitches. He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a conversation without words. Their first real words were exchanged over a stubborn fire. The weather had turned, a wet, heavy snow falling outside, and the kindling was damp. Silas was growing frustrated, his movements becoming sharp and angry. Elara, watching from the table, spoke without thinking. "My father used to say you need to give the fire air to breathe," she said softly. Silas froze, then looked at her. He had been so focused on forcing the flame, he hadn't realized he was smothering it. He rearranged the logs, creating a small channel for air. The embers caught, and a small, determined flame licked up the side of the wood. He sat back on his heels, staring at the fire. "Your father," he said, not as a question, but as an opening. "He was a blacksmith," she replied, her voice gaining a little confidence. "He said everything, from iron to a fire to a person, needs a little space to find its strength." Silas looked from the growing fire to her. He saw the truth in her words, saw how he had been trying to smother his own past, his own pain, by walling himself off. He had given her space to heal, but had allowed himself none. That small exchange cracked the ice. Their silence began to change, shifting from a tense, watchful quiet to a more comfortable, shared stillness. He started talking to her, not much, but enough. He told her the names of the birds that came to the clearing, pointed out the tracks of a snowshoe hare. She, in turn, told him about the books she used to read, about the wildflowers her mother used to grow. They were rebuilding themselves piece by piece, sharing the fragments of the people they were before the world broke them. One evening, as she sat reading his book by the firelight, she looked up to find him watching her. He wasn't carving or cleaning a weapon. He was simply watching, his expression one of profound, weary sorrow, but with something else mixed in, a quiet admiration. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a sensation she thought she had forgotten. She was not just an object of pity or a burden to him anymore. In his eyes, she was starting to see the reflection of a person she thought was gone forever. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was becoming a sanctuary. And in that small, quiet space, surrounded by a world of predators and ghosts, Two broken people were slowly, carefully, learning how to be whole again, together. Part 3. A Ghost from a Forgotten War. Back in the muddy streets of redemption, Madame Evangeline was a tempest of controlled fury. The loss of Elara Vance was more than an inconvenience. It was a loose thread that threatened to unravel her entire, meticulously woven tapestry of power. The railroad deal was worth a fortune, enough to make her the undisputed ruler of this territory, and she would not let a sniveling, consumptive girl jeopardize it. Her usual thugs were incompetent fools, better at cracking skulls than at delicate work. For this, she needed a professional, a specialist. She sent a telegram from the dusty back office of the freight company, its message coded and concise, addressed to a man whose reputation was whispered in only the darkest corners of the West. A man who found people who did not want to be found, and who cared little for their condition upon delivery. A week later, Jedediah Kane arrived in Redemption. He came not on a horse, but as a passenger on the morning stagecoach, a detail that immediately set him apart. He stepped out onto the street, a single carpetbag in his hand, and the town seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just the missing arm, though that was jarring enough. It was the chilling aura of purpose that clung to him like the dust on his black coat. His eyes, cold and pale, swept over the town, dissecting it, memorizing it. He moved with a predator's economy, wasting no motion, his gaze missing nothing. His first stop was the office of the town's only lawman, Sheriff Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man weathered by 30 years of trying to impose order on chaos. He had a drooping mustache, kind eyes that had seen too much unkindness, and a healthy suspicion of anyone who looked too clean or too dangerous. Jedediah Kane looked like both. Jed slapped the wanted poster for Elara on the sheriff's desk. Jedediah Kane. He introduced himself, his voice a dry rustle. I'm a retrieval agent. Been tracking this runaway for a lady in Helena. My information suggests she passed through your town. Sheriff Thorne leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He studied the poster, then the man in front of him. Retrieval agent? That's a polite term for a bounty hunter. I find the term more precise, Jedediah said, a thin smile touching his lips, but not his eyes. I retrieve property. The girl is property, according to my employer. Thorne disliked him instantly. He'd dealt with bounty men before. They were usually loud, greasy, and predictable. This man was different. He was coiled, intelligent, and carried the scent of old violence. There was some trouble at the Gilded Cage a week or so back, Thorne said, stroking his mustache. A stranger got into it with some of Evangeline's boys, left with one of her girls. Paid her debt, from what I hear. Jedediah's eyes sharpened. This stranger, did he have a name? Folks are calling him Blackwood. Quiet man. Kept to himself. Thorne replied, watching for a reaction. He got one. At the name, Blackwood, a flicker of something dark and triumphant crossed Jedediah's face, so quick that Thorne almost missed it. It was the look of a hunter who has finally picked up the scent of his true prey. Blackwood, Jedediah repeated softly, savoring the name. Well now, isn't that a piece of luck? He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from professional to something far more personal and menacing. I'll need to have a word with this Madame Evangeline. It seems my business here has become complicated. He turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff with a deep sense of unease. Thorne knew a lie when he heard one. The $50 reward on that poster was a pittance. No man like Cain would travel this far for such a small sum. This wasn't about a runaway girl. It was about the man named Blackwood. The sheriff rose and went to the window, watching as Cain crossed the street and entered the gilded cage. A storm was coming to redemption. He could feel it in his bones, and it had nothing to do with the weather. It was a storm of old sins and forgotten wars, and it was about to break right over his town. The meeting between Jedediah Cain and Madame Evangeline was a meeting of two vipers. It took place in her opulent office, a room of red velvet and dark wood that felt more like a throne room. Evangeline, initially dismissive, quickly realized this was no common bounty hunter. Jedediah laid his terms on the table with chilling clarity. The $50 was an insult. He knew the girl was a witness, and he knew who she was a witness against. His price would be $5,000. $2,000 now, $3,000 upon confirmation that the problem was permanently solved. Evangeline balked, but Jedediah's cold, knowing stare told her he held all the cards. He knew her secrets, and he was the only man who could erase her mistake. The deal was struck. Jedediah's hunt began not with a frantic ride into the mountains, but with a quiet, methodical investigation. He was a student of his quarry. He knew Silas Blackwood. He knew how his captain's mind worked, the caution, the paranoia, the deep-seated instinct to find high, defensible ground far from civilization. He spoke to the livery boy who had seen Silas's horse, noting its breed and the type of wear on its shoes. He visited the general store, inquiring about the supplies Silas had purchased, enough for one man for a month, which told Jedediah that Silas hadn't planned on acquiring a companion. This was an improvisation, a weakness. Silas was acting on instinct, not strategy. And instinct, Jedediah knew, could be exploited. He followed the trail out of town, a trail that was already a week old and mostly vanished. But he wasn't tracking hoofprints. He was tracking a ghost, reading the landscape through Silas's eyes, predicting the paths a cautious man would take. Meanwhile, in the mountain sanctuary, an unaccustomed peace had settled over the cabin. The raw fear that had defined Elara's existence was slowly being replaced by a fragile trust. One afternoon, Silas was teaching her how to identify edible plants near the creek bed. He was pointing out the broad leaves of wild mint when her hand brushed against his as she reached for a sprig. A current passed between them, startling in its intensity. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the space between them was no longer filled with just shared trauma, but with a new, unspoken possibility. Silas cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell, but the memory of the touch lingered, warm and resonant. It was a glimpse of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Feeling the need for fresh meat, Silas decided to check his more distant trap lines, higher up the ridge. "Stay close to the cabin," he told Elara, a familiar note of caution in his voice. "I'll be back before sundown." He was gone for several hours. Elara spent the time gathering firewood, her movements light, a hum on her lips. The cabin felt safe, a world unto itself. But it was a fragile illusion. While they were gone, Jedediah Cain found it. He approached the clearing with the silence of a wolf, his single hand resting on his gun. He observed the cabin, noting the neatly stacked wood, the faint tracks leading to the creek. He saw the signs of a second person, a woman. He smiled. The bait was still with the prey. He could have ended it then. Waited in ambush. But that wasn't his style. Revenge was a meal to be savored, not rushed. He wanted Silas to know he was coming. He wanted him to feel the cold dread of the past rising to strangle him. He crept to the cabin door, which was unlatched. He slipped inside, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. He saw the two separate beds, the woman's shawl draped over a chair, the book on the mantel. He walked over to Silas's cot. From his pocket, he pulled a small, heavy object. It was a .58 caliber mini ball, the conical lead bullet used in the Springfield rifles they had carried during the war. Its base was deformed, showing it had been fired and recovered. He placed it squarely in the center of Silas's pillow, a stark, metallic threat against the plain wool. Then he slipped out as silently as he had come. Silas and Elara returned just as the sun began to set. Elara went inside first, happy to be back in the warmth. Silas followed, carrying a brace of rabbits. "I'll make a stew," Elara started to say, but her words died in her throat. She was looking at Silas. He had stopped dead in the middle of the room, his gaze locked on his cot. The rabbits dropped from his hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud. His face, which had begun to show signs of warmth and life, was now a bloodless mask of horror. Elara followed his gaze and saw only a small, misshapen piece of lead on his pillow. "What is it?" she whispered, confused by his reaction. Silas didn't answer. He walked toward the cot as if in a trance. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the mini ball. He closed his fist around it, the metal cold against his skin. He knew this bullet. He knew the man who would leave it. The carefully constructed piece of his world shattered into a million pieces. He wasn't Silas Blackwood, the quiet homesteader, anymore. He was Captain Blackwood of the 3rd Confederate Sharpshooters, and his most ruthless sergeant had just announced his arrival. The war hadn't ended. It had only been sleeping, and now it had found him. Part 4. The Weight of a Gun. The discovery of the mini-ball plunged the cabin into a frigid silence that had nothing to do with the encroaching winter. The fragile warmth that had blossomed between Silas and Elara vanished, consumed by the cold shadow of the past. Silas became a ghost once more, his movements stiff, his eyes vacant and locked on some distant, bloody horizon only he could see. He cleaned his guns, the ones he used for hunting, with a feverish intensity, his knuckles white, his jaw set like granite. He barely ate, and he didn't sleep. He would sit by the fire all night, the rifle across his lap, watching the windows, waiting. For Elara, this regression was more terrifying than any physical threat. She had seen him as a savior, a protector. Now, she saw a man haunted to the point of breaking, a prisoner in his own mind. She tried to speak to him, but her words fell into the chasm that had opened between them. He would grunt in response, or simply not acknowledge her at all. The man who had gently cleaned her wounds was gone, replaced by the cold, efficient soldier he was trying to bury. After 2 days of this suffocating tension, she could bear it no longer. He was standing by the window, staring out at the snow-dusted pines, when she finally confronted him. "Talk to me, Silas," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "What was that thing? That piece of lead? Who left it?" He didn't turn. "It's nothing that concerns you." "Nothing that concerns me?" she cried, her frustration boiling over into anger. "I was bought and sold like cattle. I was beaten and starved. I was brought here by a man I don't know to a life I don't understand. And now there is a threat so great it has turned you into a stone statue. I think it concerns me." Her outburst, so full of fire and pain, finally broke through his shell. He turned from the window, and she was shocked by the raw agony in his eyes. It was the look of a damned soul. "You want to know?" he asked, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "Fine. I'll tell you." He sank into a chair by the table, the weight of his history pressing down on him. "His name is Jedediah Kane. He was my sergeant, my right hand, during the war." He spoke of the conflict not as a tale of glory, but as a descent into hell. He described the mud, the screams, the constant presence of death. He was a captain of a sharpshooter unit, feared for their lethality and precision. And Jedediah had been the most lethal of them all. "He enjoyed it," Silas said, his voice hollow. "The killing. He saw it as a craft. I saw it as a sickness that was consuming us all." He told her of the last engagement, a brutal skirmish in a Virginia swamp. They had a unit of Union soldiers pinned down, outgunned and surrounded. Jedediah wanted to finish them, to slaughter every last one. But Silas had seen their faces. They were boys, terrified and broken. In a moment that would define the rest of his life, he chose mercy. He ordered his men to accept their surrender. As they were laying down their arms, a lone, hidden Union sniper fired a final, desperate shot. The bullet shattered Jedediah's arm. "He never forgave me," Silas continued, staring at his own hands as if they were covered in blood. "He said my weakness cost him his arm, his pride, his future. After the war, I heard he became a manhunter, a bounty man. He channels all that hate, all that rage, into his work. And now, he's found me." He looked up at her, his face etched with a despair so profound it stole her breath. "When the war ended, I swore an oath. I buried my guns. I swore on the graves of every man I killed that I would never take another human life, no matter the reason." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Jedediah knows that. He knows me better than anyone. He's not just here to kill me. He's here to make me break that oath. He's here to prove that deep down, I'm still the monster he always admired." The full weight of their situation crashed down on Elara. They were being hunted by a man who was not just a killer, but a demon from Silas's personal hell, a man who sought not just death, but damnation. Elara looked at the broken man before her, a man so trapped by his vow that he was ready to die rather than become what he once was. She saw the nobility in it, the desperate grasp for redemption. But she also saw the futility. Jedediah Kane would not be reasoned with. He would not stop. Silas's vow was a shield against his own soul, but it was no defense against a bullet. In that moment, she realized that her silence was a luxury they could no longer afford. Her secret was not just a burden, it was a weapon. "You're wrong, Silas," she said, her voice finding a new strength, a new clarity. "This isn't just about your past. It's about my future." He looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Sevens." She took a deep breath. "The night before you found me, I was in Madame Evangeline's office. I overheard her talking to a lawyer. She's committing fraud, Silas. She's using fake maps to sell worthless land to the railroad for a fortune. She's stealing land, water rights, ruining families. She knows I hurt her. That's why she wants me back. It's not about my debt. She wants me dead. She needs me silenced. Silas stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. The fury in Evangeline's eyes. The hiring of a specialist like Cain. This wasn't a simple bounty hunt. It was a kill order, sanctioned by greed and power. They couldn't run. Evangeline's reach was long, and with the railroad's money behind her, she could hire a dozen more men like Jedediah. There was no hiding place in the world that would be safe for them. They were trapped, not just by a ghost from the past, but by a conspiracy that controlled the future of the entire territory. A new light entered Silas's eyes. The haunted, fatalistic despair was replaced by the cold, hard glint of a strategist assessing a battlefield. It was no longer just about his soul. It was about her life. The thought of Evangeline's corruption and Jedediah's malice claiming this one, fragile spark of goodness that had entered his life, it was intolerable. His vow was a personal penance. But sacrificing Elara on that same altar was not redemption. It was a sin of a different kind. Without another word, he stood. He crossed the room to the stone hearth, pried loose a large flagstone with the tip of his hunting knife, and reached into the dark cavity beneath. When he rose, he was holding a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on the table and unrolled it. The lamplight glinted off the dark, well-oiled steel of the weapons within. There was a Sharp's rifle, a single-shot behemoth known for its terrifying accuracy at long distances, and next to it, a Lamat revolver. A unique and brutal weapon of the Confederacy, it held 9 pistol rounds and a secondary, single-shot shotgun barrel. It was a weapon made for close, desperate fighting. The last time he had held them, his hands had been covered in the blood of other men. He picked up the Lamat, its weight familiar and sickening. The weight of all his sins. Elara watched, her heart aching for him. She saw the revulsion on his face, the slight tremor in his hand as he checked the cylinder. He was holding his own damnation, but he was choosing to hold it for her. He looked at her, his eyes grim. "We're not running. We're making a stand. Here." The next few hours were a grim preparation for war. He showed her how to barricade the door, how to shutter the windows, leaving only small slits to see through. Then came the hardest part. From the bundle, he took out a small, .32 caliber Remington Derringer. He pressed it into her hand. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice flat. "I don't want to," she whispered, the cold metal feeling profane in her palm. "I know," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "But I can't be everywhere at once. If he gets inside, if something happens to me, you cannot hesitate." With a heavy heart, he showed her how to load the 2 small cartridges, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. Each instruction was a betrayal of the peace he had sought, a step back into the darkness. As she held the small gun, its potential for death so enormous in her hands, Elara understood. Silas wasn't just giving her a weapon. He was giving her a choice, an agency she had never been allowed before. The weight of the gun was terrible, but the weight of helplessness, she realized, was far, far worse. Part 5. Redemption's Last Stand. The blizzard arrived on the 3rd day, a white fury that descended from the peaks without warning. It was as if the mountains themselves were trying to erase the cabin from existence, burying the world in a swirling vortex of snow and ice. The wind shrieked, clawing at the log walls, rattling the newly shuttered windows. Inside, the world shrank to the size of the small room, lit only by the nervous, dancing flames of the fire. The storm that had trapped them also served as Jedediah Kane's perfect cloak. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every scream of the wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the cabin's timbers sounded like a door being forced. Silas sat in a chair facing the entrance, the Sharps rifle resting across his knees, his posture rigid, his senses stretched to their breaking point. He was back in the war, waiting for a charge across a misty field, the terrible silence before the slaughter. Elara found she could not be still. She made coffee, she stoked the fire, she paced the length of the small room, the derringer a cold, heavy lump in her apron pocket. She watched Silas, saw the way his eyes tracked unseen movements, the way his thumb would unconsciously stroke the hammer of his rifle. He was a tightly wound spring, and she feared what would happen when he finally broke. The first attack came after midnight. It wasn't an attack at all, but a test. A single, sharp crack, distinct from the howl of the wind, and the wooden shutter on the window nearest Elara exploded inwards, showering the floor with splinters. She screamed, diving to the floor, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. Silas was in motion before the splinters even landed, diving away from the firelight, rolling into the shadows near the far wall. "He's testing our position," Silas hissed, his voice a low growl. "He knows where we are now. Stay down." Jedediah was playing with them. He was a master of psychological warfare, something Silas knew all too well. He wasn't interested in a simple siege. He wanted to unravel them, to peel back the layers of their sanity until all that was left was raw, screaming terror. Hours passed. The only sounds were the storm and their own ragged breathing. Then, a new sound. A low, rhythmic scraping coming from the back wall of the cabin. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. "What is he doing?" Elara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Trying to get in." "No," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the wall. "He's trying to get me to go out." It was a classic diversionary tactic. Make your enemy believe the threat is in one location, while the real attack comes from another. Silas refused to take the bait. He remained in his position, his focus unwavering. The scraping stopped. Another hour of silence. Elara had almost begun to believe it was over for the night when a new light flickered through the cracks in the shutters. An unnatural, orange glow. "The woodshed," Silas breathed, a curse under his breath. He scrambled to the nearest peephole. The small shed where they stored their winter fuel was engulfed in flames, the fire roaring defiance against the blizzard. It was a brilliant, cruel move. Their firewood was their life. Without it, they would freeze to death long before they starved. Jedediah was forcing his hand. He had to go out. Silas looked at Elara, his face a grim mask. "Barricade the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason. Not until you hear my voice, and only my voice. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He handed her the heavy Lamat revolver. "If he gets in, aim for the center of his chest. Don't think. Just pull the trigger until it's empty." He took a deep breath, then moved to the door. He paused, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. For a second, the hard soldier's mask slipped, and she saw the man who had taught her the names of birds. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. But he couldn't finish. He shook his head, turned, and slipped out into the raging storm, a ghost swallowed by the white chaos. Elara rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she dropped the heavy bar into place. She was alone, with a dead man's gun, a fire raging outside, and a monster hunting in the storm. The moment the door slammed shut behind Silas, Elara's world became a symphony of terror. The wind howled like a banshee, the fire crackled with a hungry roar, and her own heartbeat hammered a frantic rhythm in her ears. She gripped the Lamat revolver with both hands, its weight a terrifying burden. She peered through a slit in the window shutter, trying to catch a glimpse of Silas, but the swirling snow was a solid, impenetrable curtain. She saw only the demonic dance of the flames from the woodshed, casting wild, leaping shadows across the clearing. Silas, meanwhile, moved with a hunter's instinct, using the blizzard's chaos as his own ally. He didn't run toward the fire. He knew that was the kill zone. Instead, he circled wide, melting into the trees, the Sharps rifle held low, his eyes scanning for the telltale silhouette of a man against the snow. He was a ghost in his own right, a creature of shadow and violence, every sense honed by years of warfare. He felt Jedediah before he saw him, a subtle shift in the wind, the snap of a frozen twig that was too deliberate for an animal. But it was all a ruse. The fire, the hunt in the woods, it was the grand diversion. The real attack was never meant for Silas. As he stalked the perimeter of his property, a floorboard inside the cabin, near the cold hearth, was slowly, silently pried upwards. Jedediah Kane emerged from the crawlspace beneath the cabin like a demon rising from the earth, covered in dirt and grim determination. He had been digging his way under the foundation for hours, the storm masking the sound of his labor. Elara, her attention fixed on the window, never heard him. She sensed a sudden draft of cold air, a shift in the room's atmosphere. She spun around, the heavy revolver swinging with her. Jedediah was there, not 10 feet away, a cruel, triumphant grin on his face. He lunged before she could process the threat, his one powerful arm batting the gun from her grasp. It clattered uselessly across the floor. He grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other arm a band of iron around her waist. He dragged her toward the door, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and pressing the cold steel against her throat. "Captain!" Jedediah roared, his voice carrying over the storm. "Oh, Captain! Your little bird is mine. Drop your rifle and come into the light, or she dies with a smile from ear to ear." Outside, Silas froze. The voice, dripping with venom and familiarity, cut through the wind and straight into his soul. He saw the cabin door being unbarred and kicked open. He saw the silhouette of Jedediah, using Elara as a human shield. The choice was immediate and absolute. He dropped the Sharps rifle into the snow and walked slowly into the clearing, his hands raised. He stopped 20 feet from the porch, the firelight from the burning shed illuminating the scene in a hellish glow. "Let her go, Jed," Silas said, his voice unnervingly calm. "This is between us. It always has been." Jedediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "It was always about your weakness, Captain. Your sentiment. You see a broken bird, you have to fix it. That's what cost me my arm. And now it's going to cost you your life." He pressed the knife harder against Elara's throat, a thin line of red appearing on her skin. "But first, you're going to break that precious little vow of yours. Pick up the revolver," she dropped. "I want to see the look in your eyes when you become a killer again." Silas's gaze locked with Elara's. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw a flicker of the same defiance she'd shown in the streets of redemption. Her eyes darted down to Jedediah's legs, then back to his. It was a signal. A desperate, crazy plan. A choice. In that moment, something shifted in Silas. It wasn't about the vow anymore. It wasn't about his damned soul. It was about her. She chose him, and he was choosing her. "You saved me, Silas," Elara choked out, her voice raw. "Not because you had to. Because you chose to. Now I'm choosing, too." With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, she stomped her heel down, hard, on Jedediah's instep and threw her head back, smashing it into his face. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Silas needed. He didn't pick up the gun. He exploded forward, covering the distance in 3 powerful strides. The fight was not a duel. It was a savage, primal brawl. It was fists and feet and teeth in the clothes, brutal confines of the cabin doorway. Jedediah, despite his missing arm, was ferociously strong, but Silas was fueled by years of repressed rage and a desperate need to protect. The fight ended as brutally as it began. Silas got his hands on the hunting knife Jedediah had dropped. There was a final, desperate struggle, a choked gasp, and Jedediah Kane collapsed into the snow, the life fading from his eyes. Silas stood over him, panting, his body screaming with pain, his knuckles raw and bleeding. He had won. He had saved her. But as he looked at the still form of his old sergeant, then at his own hands, now holding the bloody knife, a violent tremor racked his body. The dam of his control broke, and the full, horrifying flood of his past rushed in, drowning him. He sank to his knees, the knife dropping from his nerveless fingers, a silent scream trapped in his throat. Part 6. Where the Wildflowers Grow. The blizzard died with Jedediah Kane. As his last breath ghosted into the frigid air, the wind seemed to lose its fury, softening to a mournful whisper. The snow tapered off, and a profound, ringing silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the hiss and pop of the dying woodshed fire and Silas's own ragged, gasping breaths. He was on his knees in the snow, shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide and unseeing. He wasn't in the clearing anymore. He was back in the swamps of Virginia, in the smoke-choked fields of Antietam, the faces of the dead rising around him like a phantom tide. The smell of blood, both fresh and old, filled his nostrils. He had broken his vow. The monster was loose, and it was consuming him from the inside out. Elara, recovering from the shock, scrambled to her feet. She saw the dead man in the snow, the blood staining the pristine white. Then she saw Silas. He was lost, utterly and completely. Her own fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but seeing him so shattered ignited something fierce and protective within her. She had been the one who needed saving. Now, it was her turn. She ran to him, ignoring the corpse at her feet, and knelt in the snow beside him. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Silas, look at me. It's over. You're safe. We're safe." He didn't respond. his eyes staring through her. His hands were clenched into fists, his body rigid. She reached out and took his hand. It was as cold as ice, and trembling violently. She wrapped both of her hands around his, trying to pour her own warmth, her own life, into him. "You did it to save me," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "It was not a sin. It was a choice, a sacrifice. Come back, Silas. Please, come back to me." Slowly, painstakingly, she led him back inside the cabin. He moved like an automaton, his feet shuffling, his gaze still lost in the past. The room was a wreck, furniture overturned, blood on the floorboards. Elara ignored it all. She guided him to the cot, eased him down, and wrapped him in every blanket she could find. He continued to shake, his teeth chattering, caught in the grip of a trauma so deep she feared it might never let him go. For the rest of the night, she was his anchor. She cleaned and bandaged the cuts on his hands and face. She brewed strong, hot coffee and held the cup to his lips, making him drink. She sat beside him, holding his hand, and talked. She told him about her childhood, about her mother's garden, about the feel of the sun on her face. She filled the terrifying silence of his mind with her voice, weaving a lifeline of simple, ordinary memories to pull him back from the abyss. Just as the first, pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters, a new sound reached them, the crunch of boots on fresh snow. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the Lamat revolver, her hands shaking, and pointed it at the door. There was a loud knock. "Silas Blackwood!" A voice called out, firm and authoritative. "This is Sheriff Thorne. I'm coming in." The door swung open, and the weary sheriff stood there, his shotgun held at the ready. He took in the scene in an instant. The barricaded room, the terrified woman with a gun too big for her, the dead body clearly visible outside, and Silas, sitting on the cot, a shell of a man staring into nothingness. Thorne's gaze softened with a deep, sad understanding. He lowered his shotgun. "Son," he said, his voice laced with a profound weariness. "What in God's name happened here?" Sheriff Thorne listened. He stood by the hearth, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the cold tragedy that had unfolded, and he listened as Elara told him everything. Her voice, though trembling at first, grew stronger as she spoke. She left nothing out. The debt, Madame Evangeline, the land fraud conspiracy, the arrival of Jedediah Cain, and the terrible choice Silas had been forced to make. She spoke of Silas's past, his vow, and the sacrifice he had made to save her. Thorne watched her as she spoke, his experienced eyes gauging her honesty. He glanced at Silas, who had not moved, his silence a more powerful testimony than any words. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. The sheriff walked to the door and looked out at Jedediah Cain's body, already being dusted with a fresh layer of snow. He had suspected from the start that Cain was more than a simple bounty hunter. He had seen the darkness in him, and he had seen the calculated evil in Madame Evangeline's eyes. He came back inside and stood before them. He was the law in this territory, but he knew the law was a blunt instrument, incapable of understanding the complex geometry of a man's soul. What had happened here was not a simple murder. It was an execution, an exorcism. Jedediah Cain rode out of redemption 2 days ago, headed into the teeth of the worst blizzard this territory has seen in a decade, the sheriff said, his voice slow and deliberate, as if dictating an official report. He was a foolhardy man, chasing a paltry bounty. He never returned. Must have lost his way in the storm. His body will likely turn up in the spring thaw, miles from here. He looked directly at Elara, then at Silas. This fire in your woodshed was an accident, caused by the storm. You were lucky the whole cabin didn't go up. You'll have to be more careful. He was giving them a story. A way out. A second chance. I'll help you with the cleanup, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the door. Then I expect to see you both in town in a week's time to file a report on the accidental fire. Understood. Elara could only nod, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. The months that followed were a quiet season of healing. True to his word, Sheriff Thorne closed the case on Jedediah Kane. And true to her own resolve, Elara found a way to act. She wrote a detailed, anonymous letter, laying out the entirety of Madame Evangeline's land fraud scheme, and sent it with a traveling merchant bound for the territorial capital. By springtime, federal marshals had arrived in Redemption, and Evangeline's gilded empire began to crumble under the weight of her own corruption. At the cabin, the healing was slower, more personal. Silas gradually emerged from the depths of his trauma, pulled back to the world by Elara's unwavering patience and care. There were still nights when he woke up screaming, but now he would find her hand already in his, her calm presence a steady anchor in the storm of his memories. He started to talk again, not about the war, but about the future. He repaired the burned woodshed, his hands finding purpose not in destruction, but in creation. He began to smile again, small, tentative smiles that transformed his whole face. One sunny afternoon, Elara found him tilling a small patch of earth beside the cabin. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Your mother liked wildflowers," he said, not looking at her. "I thought, this place could use some." In that moment, she saw that he was finally beginning to forgive himself. He was planting a garden where there had only been blood and snow. They worked together, their hands in the cool, rich earth, planting seeds for a future they had fought for and won. They stood, side by side, looking out at the valley, now awash with the vibrant greens of spring. They were not the same people who had met in the muddy streets of Redemption. Their innocence was gone, replaced by the hard-won wisdom of survival. They were scarred, imperfect, and haunted. But for the first time in their lives, standing together under the vast Montana sky, they were whole. The wind that whispered through the pines no longer spoke of sorrow. It hummed a quiet, hopeful song of new beginnings. In a land where the past was a relentless hunter and survival was a daily battle, a broken soldier and a woman with nothing left to lose found in each other not a cure, but a reason to heal. The story of Silas and Elara is not one of a knight saving a damsel, but of two scarred souls finding the courage to face their demons together. It is a testament to the fact that redemption is not found in forgetting, but in fighting for a future worthy of the sacrifices made. Silas laid down his gun only to find that he had to pick it up again, not for glory or hatred, but for love. Elara, who believed herself worthless, discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, not only to survive, but to save her savior in turn. Their love story was not written in flowery words, but in shared silence, in quiet acts of care, and in the shared understanding of pain. It bloomed in the harshest of winters, a stubborn wildflower pushing its way through frozen earth, proving that even in the most desolate of landscapes, hope can take root and grow. If their journey from the darkest shadows into the light has moved you, please show your support. Like this video, share their story of resilience, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale reminds us that the most profound love is often found in the most broken of hearts. Join us again for the next chapter.